Over the weekend, President Biden honored George Soros with the Medal of Freedom, America's pinnacle civilian accolade. Although, in fairness, one might question whether Biden himself was aware of doing so. But as Soros, who funded the campaigns of progressive prosecutors all around the country, and is thus arguably the architect of today's urban chaos, really a hero worthy of America's highest civilian honor? Let's talk about it. I am, of course, attorney Andrew Branca for Law of Self-Defense, and for those of you who stay to the end, I'll share with you how you can get a free copy of our best-selling book, The Law of Self-Defense Principles, your handbook to being hard to convict if you're ever compelled to use force in defense of yourself, your family, or your property. So this past weekend, President Biden awarded George Soros, as well as 18 others, the nation's highest civilian award, the Medal of Freedom. Let's take a look at the White House announcement on this, and particularly their description of George Soros as someone suitable for such a high award. Quoting now, "Today, President Biden named 19 recipients of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. The Presidential Medal of Freedom is the nation's highest civilian honor, presented to individuals who have made exemplary contributions to the prosperity, values, or security of the United States, world peace, or other significant societal, public, or private endeavors. President Biden believes great leaders keep the faith, give everyone a fair shot, and put decency above all else. These 19 individuals are great leaders who have made America and the world a better place. They are great leaders because they are good people who have made extraordinary contributions to their country and the world." These medals of freedom were handed out on January 4th, 2025, and among the recipients was, of course, George Soros, who the White House describes as an investor, philanthropist, and founder of the Open Society Foundations. Through his network of foundations, partners, and projects in more than 120 countries, Soros has focused on global initiatives that strengthen democracy, human rights, education, and social justice. Now, billionaire George Soros is surrounded by a maelstrom of various narratives, myths, conspiracy theories dating back to his youth when he reportedly worked cooperatively with the Nazis in World War II, but that's not the focus of my show today. My interest is in the law, and so I'll be focusing on what George Soros has done to so profoundly undermine the rule of law and public order in America generally, and our urban centers in particular. In the interest of not having a show full of nothing but negativity and lamentations, I'll note up front that it does appear that the American body politic may have begun, at long last, a visceral and existential rejection of Soros and his order-gutting policies. I'll circle back to that in a moment. Soros recognized a facet of the American criminal justice system that was a ripe target for any progressive fascist seeking a high degree of leverage in undermining law and order within America's urban centers, and that is that prosecutors are both incredibly powerful in their elected positions, and they are also dirt cheap to buy. Prosecutors in America have virtually unlimited discretion in their charging decisions, and even more discretion in their non-charging decisions, where they simply decide to not press charges against a criminal suspect. In the context of a charging decision that seems unjust, we at least have fundamental due process to hold prosecutors accountable. By that I mean that every criminal defendant is entitled to effective assistance of legal counsel and to due process of law, and the burden is on the prosecution to prove guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. When it comes to non-charging decisions, however, that is, deciding to not charge someone with a crime when there exists probable cause, and maybe a great deal more than probable cause to believe they are guilty and subject to effective prosecution, well, then there's virtually no check, whatever, on a prosecutor who simply decides to not bring criminal suspects to trial, to offer them sweetheart plea deals, or to simply not even bring criminal charges in the first place. In theory, of course, elected prosecutors might face a very modest risk of losing re-election years down the road and face a minuscule risk of being recalled, though this has happened, or of being removed by a higher level state officer, and this also has happened. But all of those are very low probability sanctions and generally years removed from their pro-crime, anti-social order policies and all the societal damage they inflict on their urban communities. It doesn't take a genius to realize that if criminal behavior is not legally sanctioned to any meaningful degree, you simply get more criminal behavior. It's rather the opposite of the broken windows policies adopted by then New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani back in the 1990s, with which he largely broke the spine of widespread unlawfulness then plaguing the Big Apple, returning a large degree of social order back to the city. George Soros has expressed the belief that many urban residents were being over-prosecuted, so he sought to advance the election of prosecutors who would literally be soft on crime. And as I've noted, there's simply no meaningful check on prosecutors who decide they are not going to be bringing violent criminals to trial, or who release them on much reduced plea deals, or simply stop charging entirely on large swaths of criminal activity such as property theft below $1,000. I mean, what could go wrong? Except for the explosion of violent crime, property crime, and social disorder, including widespread semi-permanent homeless encampments that has occurred in so many of America's urban centers in recent years. Perhaps no one was more surprised than George Soros to learn exactly how cheap it was to purchase prosecutors willing to follow his policy goals of being soft on crime. It wasn't even necessary to bribe prosecutors currently in office. Instead, Soros could massively fund any progressive lawyer running to unseat a current prosecutor and effectively buy the election. Elections for prosecutorial positions are generally low-key and low-budget affairs. Traditionally, most prosecutors were long-standing members of the legal community. They were usually, to use the current vernacular, OGs of the criminal bar, well-respected and familiar, stable, reliable, unlikely to yield surprises in policy. Because prosecutorial elections were generally low-key, they usually attracted little public attention, little competition, and therefore required relatively modest campaign budgets. Very few voters, if asked, would be able to name their local prosecutor or even recognize their name on a ballot. And most prosecutorial elections involved campaign budgets on the order of a few thousands of dollars, or perhaps tens of thousands of dollars. If one prosecutorial candidate running in the traditional manner has a campaign war chest of traditional size, say $20,000, and suddenly finds himself facing off against a new challenger who is being backed with a Soros-funded war chest of $200,000 or maybe $2 million, well, it's not hard to understand that the Soros-backed candidate has pretty much just purchased that office. By many reports, in recent years, Soros has, through his various foundations, provided in excess of $50 million, some say $75 million in campaign funds to back roughly 40 prosecutors in major urban centers. That works out to an average of well over $1 million per race, though, of course, higher profile races in larger urban centers received greater sums, and lower profile races received fewer. In many cases, as much as 90% of the campaign funding of any particular Soros-backed prosecutorial candidate was Soros money, meaning they were effectively entirely funded by Soros with little other backing or anybody else to answer to. They were a wholly owned George Soros subsidiary. To give a sense of the breadth of Soros' efforts in owning prosecutors in American urban centers, here's a brief list of almost 20 major cities in which the leading prosecutor is or has been a Soros-backed candidate: Portland, Oregon; Oakland, California; San Francisco, California; Los Angeles, California; Minneapolis, Minnesota; Chicago, Illinois; St. Louis, Missouri; Memphis, Tennessee; Dallas, Texas; Austin, Texas; San Antonio, Texas; New Orleans, Louisiana; Manhattan, New York; Philadelphia, Pennsylvania; Baltimore, Maryland; Arlington, Virginia; Tampa, Florida; Orlando, Florida. There are many other cities I could have added to this list, but the ones I listed almost entirely consist of prosecutorial races in which Soros dumped a minimum of $1 million to effectively buy that seat. By some measures, fully 20% of the American population has been made subject to the policies of Soros-bought prosecutors, and of course a much higher percentage of Americans living in urban centers. All of those cities are also likely familiar to you as suffering exceptionally high rates of violent crime, property crime, semi-permanent homeless encampments, and general disorder. The fruit invariably born of Soros's soft on crime, hard on public order prosecutors. This reality stands in stark contrast to the rationale for the Medal of Freedom set down in statute by Congress when they created this highest civilian medal. That language reads in relevant part that the Medal of Freedom may be awarded by the President to any person who has made an especially meritorious contribution to 1, the national security of the United States, 2, world peace, or 3, cultural or other significant public or private endeavors. Soros' funding of dozens of soft-on-crime prosecutors who have turned their judicial districts into crime-ridden hellholes certainly can't qualify as a contribution to the national security of the United States, nor to world peace. So presumably, we're supposed to believe that this tsunami of violent crime, property crime, homelessness, and public disorder that are the consequence of Soros' funding of prosecutors represents some kind of cultural or other significant public or private endeavor. I suppose that President Biden and I will have to agree to disagree on that assessment of what Soros has wrought with his gangs of pro-crime prosecutors. Now, on a happier note, I did say at the start that I didn't want this show on Soros to be nothing but negativity and lamentations, and did suggest that the American body politic may have begun at long last a visceral and existential rejection of Soros and his order-gutting policies and prosecutors. Here are a few examples of what may be the pendulum swinging back against George Soros and his prosecutors. Soros-backed prosecutor Chesa Boudin of San Francisco, who was recently recalled from office after he oversaw an epidemic of disorder in an already disordered city. Soros-backed prosecutor Kim Gardner of St. Louis, who was ousted from office following her politically motivated prosecution of Patricia and Mark McCloskey after they armed themselves with guns and faced down a violent Black Lives Matter protest outside their home. Soros-backed prosecutor Marilyn Mosby of Baltimore after she persecuted 6 totally innocent police officers over the in-custody death of Freddie Gray, as well as was federally convicted of felony fraud. Soros-backed prosecutor Rachel Rollins of Boston, who was compelled to resign after numerous ethics violations and the leakage of government secrets to influence the election of a political ally. Soros-backed prosecutor Fani Willis of Atlanta, who brought a politically motivated case against President Trump, was ordered removed from that case by higher courts after demonstrable misconduct, and who is now being forced to testify under oath before the Georgia legislature over her alleged misconduct in that and other cases. Soros-backed prosecutor Kimberly Fox of Chicago, who was driven from office after dropping more felony charge cases than any previous prosecutor in the city's history, and who was stripped just last month of her Illinois license to practice law entirely. Soros-backed prosecutor Andrew Warren of Tampa, who was successfully stripped of his elected position by Florida Governor Ron DeSantis after the prosecutor announced he was simply not going to prosecute a wide breadth of property crimes. Now, I'd like to think that the criminal justice pendulum is beginning to swing back from the insane pro-crime policies of George Soros and his bought prosecutors who took their positions and oaths knowing full well that they would be refusing to prosecute the violent crimes, property crimes, homelessness, and public disorder that was plaguing their communities, which, by the way, disproportionately consist of low-income and minority populations. But only time will tell. I do, however, find it heinous that George Soros, the man behind this hollowing out of so many of America's urban centers under the color of law, and by the very people tasked and sworn to uphold public order, would be awarded the nation's highest civilian honor, the Medal of Freedom, by the sitting president whose own political party has just summarily deposed him in favor of a cackling hyena. And that's about all I have to say about that. Okay, folks, before I wrap up, I do want to share with you how you can get a free copy of our best-selling book, The Law of Self-Defense Principles, your handbook to being hard to convict if you're ever compelled to use force in defense of yourself, your family, or your property. We translate all the legalese into plain English so you can make better informed, more confident, more legally sound, and more decisive decisions in defense of what you value most. And perhaps best of all, most people tell us they can read the entire book in less than an afternoon. Check the book out on Amazon where it's 5-star rated, but don't buy it there. They'll charge you $25 for the book, plus shipping and handling. Order the book from us, and we only ask that you cover the cost of shipping the book to you. The book itself is free. Grab your free copy of The Law of Self-Defense Principles right now at lawofselfdefense.com/free book. I'll close out by reminding all of you that if you carry a gun so you're hard to kill, that's why I carry a gun, so I'm hard to kill, so my family is hard to kill, then you also owe it to yourself and your family to know the law so you're hard to convict as well. Until next time, I remain Attorney Andrew Branca at lawofselfdefense.com. Stay safe.